Is this a new pattern and why is this happening?
We have the full scale armor invasion of a European country, Ukraine, by Russia at a scale that we haven't seen really since World War II. The Chinese Communist Party has openly declared that it intends to compete and rival the United States as a world class power by 2049. China, at least through 2021, 2022, is on track to produce about 40 to 45% of global industrial output by 2030 and reducing the US to a mere 11 to 12%. My fear is that what China may be looking to do instead of an outright invasion, Danny, is undertake what we call sort of hybrid gray zone salami slice tactics. The idea that the president of the United States, whoever that might be, Republican or Democrat, cut off all communications with the president of Russia in the middle of this armored invasion, this full-scale war against Ukraine, was insanity, right?
Hey, let's welcome today's guest, John Sitilides, a Washington geopolitical strategist, principal at Trilogy Advisors, and national security senior fellow at Foreign Policy Research Institute. Welcome to the show, sir. Thank you for
It's
joining.
great to be with you, Danny. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I want to talk about geopolitics and some global developments.
Mhm.
And starting with something that I noticed in the past few years is the number of regional conflicts that has risen over the globe. You see Russia, Ukraine, you have Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, even Cambodia and Thailand. Is this a new pattern and why is this happening?
Let's break it down two ways, Danny, if we can. First of all, we do see a growing intensity in major conflict in the last several years. As you correctly note, we have the full scale armor invasion of a European country, Ukraine, by Russia at a scale that we haven't seen really since World War II. Obviously, in the Middle East, we have Iran's sort of multi headed Hydra assault on Israel through Hamas, through Hezbollah, through Iraqi and Syrian militias, through the Houthis in Yemen, obviously defanged successfully by Israel and the United States several weeks ago, but still a major conflict throughout the Middle East. But we also have the India Pakistan, I wouldn't call it a conflict precisely. We had a little bit of a standoff there, and luckily that was diffused in a matter of days. But it does seem like we've had these full scale, very intense wars and conflicts over the last several years. And of course, we have the continuing tensions created by China's very belligerent foreign policy against Taiwan, against the Philippines, against Japan, against South Korea, against almost all of its Southeast Asian neighbors, and even against India in 2020. If you recall that brief conflict in the Himalaya Mountains along the Chinese Indian border. Let me offer this. Let me put this in, first of all, sort of recent historical perspective. Let's not forget that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, we had 250,000 Europeans that were killed in the Balkan Wars that lasted almost a decade in the former Yugoslavia. We had, of course, the first Gulf War, when the US led an international coalition to oust Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait, a major war in 1991. We had the slaughter in Rwanda, right, between the Hutu and the Tutsi uh, people there, 1 million dead in Rwanda in a matter of months. And of course, we had the brutal Russian put down of the Chechen uprising in the late 1990s. We have had major wars prior to this most recent spate. Let's keep that in mind. But I think also we have now, with the rise of social media, a far greater awareness in real time around the world of the brutality and the horror of war in a way that we really weren't exposed to, say, even in the 90s and the early 2000s. It was mostly what was conveyed to at least American audiences and even global audiences by CNN, by major networks, a day later in major newspapers. And now it's real time and it's in our pockets with smartphones. And so I think there's a much more immediate and visceral and deeper impact as a result of social media technology that gives us the perception that we're in a much more dangerous period. But we've had wars and major conflicts in recent decades. And I'll close with this, Danny. I think also the fact that we do see a disruption of what was a relatively benign, relatively peaceful order overall until about 10, 15 years ago. I would say, really, with the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. And really, as I mentioned before, China's highly belligerent foreign policy since 2012, when Xi Jinping, the current general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, came to power and really turned on its head China's previous policies of hide your strength and bide your time, the so-called China's peaceful rise. And so it's not only a perception, but there's a reality of a far more aggressive series of foreign policy actions around the world in many of the most important places, especially across the Eurasian continent.
And talking about China, I want to ask you about how do you see a long-term threat from China towards the US and other Western countries? And specifically, what do you think about their threat in terms of a potential invasion of Taiwan?
Hmm. Let's start with Taiwan, first of all. There are, I think, several reasons why the Chinese Communist Party is hell bent on somehow, maybe not outright invading, like a full scale amphibious invasion of Taiwan, which would be an enormously difficult undertaking. Right? It's 100 miles of straits, very, very difficult waters to cross. This is not a Normandy style invasion across relatively placid waters, but one that is beset by typhoons, by very, very problematic weather for most of the year. And then, of course, Taiwan is doing a better job now of arming itself to the teeth in a defensive posture to try to repel any type of a Chinese invasion. But I think China remains dedicated to somehow absorbing, annexing, or even diplomatically negotiating, depending with, what kind of future governments we have in Taiwan. If it's, say, for instance, the Kuomintang, which are more reconciled to some type of a diplomatic modus vivendi with China, rather than the People's Progressive Party, which has been in power, at least had the presidency for the last several cycles. But there are several issues here. One, of course, is that we recognize that artificial intelligence powered by advanced microprocessors really will shape the global economy of the 21st century. And China remains very much behind Taiwan in that advanced microprocessing sort of chip fabrication. If they're able to annex or absorb Taiwan and the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, then China essentially has far greater influence over the global economy, including the American economy, if they're able to do so. If they're able to conquer or somehow annex Taiwan and establish air and naval bases in Taiwan, they're able to break out of the first island chain, sort of this geopolitical constraint led by the US, along with our allies like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, that constrains China's ability to project power deep into the Pacific Ocean and then south into the Indian Ocean. And so they would want that for geopolitical power projection purposes. There's also, very frankly, a legitimacy issue. The Taiwanese are largely ethnic Chinese Han. And the idea that the Chinese Communist Party is the only party that can govern China, given the vastness of Chinese society, its complexity, its 4,000-year-old history, is sort of given the lie to by the Taiwanese government and the governing system there, the political economy, given that it is probably the most robust, thriving, free market, democratic, capitalist system right now in East Asia. And so the Chinese Communist Party seeks to essentially smother Taiwan's freedom and demonstrate there really is no alternative to absolute Leninist rule by the Chinese Communist Party. But my fear is that what China may be looking to do instead of an outright invasion, Danny, is undertake what we call sort of hybrid gray zone salami slice tactics and really exhaust and attrit Taiwan's ability to withstand, to remain resilient in the face of this military, economic, and political colossus that is the People's Republic of China. And do they do this by essentially imposing a naval blockade around Taiwan, forcing the vessels and aircraft of other countries to have to submit to Chinese inspection and stoppage, of course, and inspection before they can arrive in Taiwan, which really no other country would be able to break except the United States, which then, of course, might lead to a conflict between the United States and China that I think every sober-minded strategist and policy planner seeks to avoid. Or would they do this by, say, taking over one of a multitude of tiny Taiwanese islands, either right off the coast of China or in the middle of the South China Sea, and essentially defy Taiwan to try to take back those islands from Chinese military control? So we'll look to see how this takes place. But I think the overarching strategy on the part of the United States and our East Asian allies is to continue to find creative, muscular, and robust, effective ways to deter the Chinese Communist Party from thinking that today, tomorrow, or any day next week, next month, or next year is a good day to seek to take over Taiwan diplomatically, through exhaustion, or obviously militarily. On a larger scale, in answer to your question, look, there's a book that was written a little over 2 decades ago by two People's Liberation Army colonels called Unrestricted Warfare. We don't know it, even though it's open source material. All one has to do is read Mandarin or translate it into English or whatever language one reads. The Chinese Communist Party has openly declared that it intends to compete and rival the United States as a world class power by 2049, which is the centennial of the establishment of communist power over China at the end of World War II. They're looking to have world class military power projection. They're competing with us in terms of AI and strategic technology competition. They're far ahead of us right now in terms of industrial power. There was a report that was released by the UN International Development NIDO organization several months ago, where China, at least through 2021, 2022, was on track to produce about 40 to 45% of global industrial output by 2030, and reducing the US to a mere 11 to 12%, Japan down to the single digits, Germany to single digits. And now I think the Trump administration, looking at the reality of what's been happening in China over the last half decade to decade, is very much dedicated and using federal budgetary restructuring as well as executive orders to really incentivize a return to building out the industrial and manufacturing heartland of the United States. But this is going to be the serious strategic axis around which all international relations around the world will likely revolve, and that is the AI and related science and technology competition between the United States. The US maintains a serious overall lead right now, but in terms of obviously areas like intermittent weather dependent energy, like solar and wind, electric vehicles, battery storage, robotics, China is probably ahead of the United States. The good news is that we're still ahead in artificial intelligence, but the Chinese companies are breathing down American companies' necks. And this is going to be, I think, the catalyst, the focus of where we maintain AI dominance, ideally AI supremacy, and really shape the global AI robotics ecosystem that will shape the global economy in the decades to come and leave China behind. But that's going to take a very dedicated effort, and there's no guarantee that that's going to be the outcome here in the United States. And unfortunately, we don't see that same level of commitment by our European counterparts. We do see it in partnership with a number of East Asian countries, especially Japan and South Korea. And so we're working together there to maintain that level of AI supremacy over China.
One advantage that these authoritarian countries might have over the Western countries is that because their government doesn't change as often, they can not only draw a strategy for years ahead, but also act on that strategy and get it done. On the contrary, in the US, it seems like the approach towards China and other issues, Russia Ukraine war, on the geopolitical level, it changes even economically as new administrations take place. Is it possible for the US to maintain a single long term strategy, no matter who's in charge, whether it's Democrats or Republicans? And is it happening now? Or is it an issue that can impact America in the long term?
Trying to recall if it was Winston Churchill or who it was that once opined that democracy is the worst form of government except for every other form of government. There's no perfect governing system in the world, Danny. There never has been in human history. Everything involves trade offs between bad decisions or bad outcomes and worse outcomes. So you're absolutely right. We do have a messy situation in terms of American and Western democracy and the inability to maintain a long term consistency in terms of this type of a strategic outlook towards a foe like we had with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, or now the foe that we have in the Communist Party of China. But I will say that I believe, just from my position here in Washington, D.C., that we have seen a larger consensus build out between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party pretty much over the last decade, that we really need to fixate on the communist Chinese threat to American dominance, to Western dominance of the global economy, and the global international security order to a large degree. And you don't need me to tell you that we've had very polarized domestic politics here in Washington over the last decade, especially with the rise of Donald Trump in 2016 to the presidency, and now his return to Washington, D.C. 6 months ago. But the Republicans and Democrats are trying to formulate some type of a consensus that can endure between administrations of one party or the other, because there's no guarantee that there's going to be a Republican administration in 2029. We don't even know if the Democratic Party won't take control over the House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, or both houses of Congress in the November 2026 elections next year. But I think this consensus that is building out will be enduring in the United States for some time to come, because I think the Chinese Communist threat really has crystallized in the eyes of most American political, business, and civic leaders. There are still pockets of either resistance or willful ignorance. We see this on the part of many American companies that still want to, say, do business in China, even though it threatens America's well being in the years to come. We see this from a number of financial firms. We see this from companies that are willing to conduct technology investments in China, but those numbers are diminishing. And so I think you're seeing sort of, I don't want to say political pressure, but this recognition that China is a malign actor on the global stage, and we need to rededicate ourselves to American dominance and American supremacy where we can. In Europe, it's a very different story. You have 27 members of the European Union. They all have very different perspectives. For instance, in Germany, you see on the political front a growing realization that the engagement that was once encouraged in the West, in the US, and in Europe 20 years ago is not the pathway forward. But there are still a number of German industrialists who see that the Chinese markets offer short-term profits, and they're looking to continue to invest there and to continue exporting to China. And then there are other countries like Hungary that are willing to accept Chinese investment under the Belt Road Initiative. And so there is not a uniform EU policy. This is really a matter of national sovereignty of various economies inside the European Union. So I think that's going to take a longer time to play out in terms of building this consensus. But there is no such guarantee in the United States, nor would I want there to be. I think it's healthy for American democracy to have a robust debate. I think the longer term objectives are largely congealing between Republicans and Democrats, but there will be a healthy debate as to what tactics to engage in to accomplish that goal of keeping China behind the US and making sure that we are the AI supreme power in the global economy for years and for decades to come.
Mhm. Well, that's great to know that there is a consensus in the US when it comes to China. What's interesting is that Russia, which is very close to China as of late, it seems like there is a debate on how should America see Russia, whether it's the enemy just like China, or some kind of a middleman that we can work with to deter China. And talking about Russia and its aggression against Ukraine, its war against Ukraine, where do you see the wars going with strategy in Washington that seems to be changing as of late, from trying to talk with the Russians to imposing potential sanctions on them and on their partners? Where do you think this strategy is going to go, and what's going to happen next in that war?
It's a critical question that you raised, Danny, especially right now, given the timing of what is happening on the diplomatic front between the White House, the Kremlin, and potentially Ukrainian President Zelensky, who's been largely kept out of the process of recent weeks, and frankly, the European Union, which has also been sidelined, given that neither Trump nor Putin recognize the EU as having any significant geopolitical leverage on the world stage. I mean, Brussels is essentially foundationally unable to come up with a coherent strategy when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war. I just cited the very prescient observations of a colleague of mine at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Dr. Nicholas Gvozdev, and I encourage your audience to follow him on LinkedIn and on X. But he had given a presentation in 2017 on this topic, right? This is 8 years ago, speaking about how Washington was caught up in knots in the debate between the Russia engagers and the Russia skeptics. And it kind of goes to the heart of the question that you just asked. The Russia skeptics have obviously dominated Washington foreign policy thinking since 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine, but especially since the second invasion in 2022. And there's actually been very little debate until the Trump, 45, 47 administration, the current one, that is, about how to proceed with Russia and Ukraine. But for 3 years under President Biden, there was almost no serious debate in Washington, D.C. Most of the Washington foreign policy consensus was, along with Joe Biden, to support Ukraine for, I think the quote was, for however long it takes, whatever it takes, however long it takes, without any serious exit strategy, without any sense of how to engage in diplomacy with Vladimir Putin, with Volodymyr Zelensky, to try to bring about a genuine peace between these two significant powers in the Eurasian continent. And you have that now, and I think that's a good thing. I think we need a healthy debate between the Russia skeptics and the Russia engagers, because Russia really is not only a nuclear superpower, but it is a commodity superpower, and it is going to be along Europe's eastern frontier forever. Russia's not going anywhere, and there's no guarantee that if Vladimir Putin were to disappear from the scene tomorrow, if he were to have a heart attack or to be assassinated or overthrown, that some type of a Belgian or Swiss genteel diplomat type with outreach to Europe necessarily takes over power in Moscow. It could be someone of an even more heinous, butcher-like perspective, say someone out of Chechnya, who takes over in Moscow. And then we have an even more dangerous situation between Europe and Russia. So we're dealing right now with a very, very challenging situation in Vladimir Putin's control over Moscow. Remember, whoever governs Moscow governs over 1/8 of the world's landmass, spanning 11 time zones and able to project malign power in Central and Eastern Europe, as the suffering millions in Ukraine have come to know, in the Middle East, deep into Africa, where Russia sells armaments to several dozen dictatorships, keeping down their societies in very corrupt countries. In South Asia, there was a brief war between the Soviet Union and China in 1969, and Russia today continues to dispute the sovereignty of a number of northern Japanese islands, and it is just across a very important maritime choke point from the United State of Alaska in the Bering Strait, and it is right now probably the dominant or becoming the dominant military power in the emerging strategic theater of the Arctic region. So Russia is a very serious country to deal with any day of the year. And I think it's very important in terms of what President Trump is trying to accomplish. I think it's three goals here, Danny. One is to restore U.S.-Russia relations, that what we had under President Biden was untenable. The idea that the President of the United States, whoever that might be, Republican or Democrat, cut off all communications with the president of Russia in the middle of this armored invasion, this full-scale war against Ukraine, was insanity, right? Policy insanity. So I give President Trump credit for the outreach to President Trump, to President Putin, their regular phone calls, as well as his engagement with President Zelensky. Both parties have to agree if there's going to be a ceasefire or a long-term political settlement. But there is the reality of the situation on the ground, Danny, that we cannot ignore. And that is that Russia is a much larger economic and military power. As I mentioned before, not only a nuclear superpower, but a commodity superpower that has been able to maintain and actually grow its military over the last 3.5 years since the invasion of Ukraine by selling oil and gas and coal and timber and diamonds and other natural resources, critical metals, minerals, rare earth elements. The European Union is still buying vast quantities of liquefied natural gas from Russia. And until last year, the US was buying 25% of its enriched uranium to power our nuclear reactors from Russia. And so we have to keep in mind that's how Russia, to a considerable extent, not completely, has been able to largely sanctions-proof its economy from what Vladimir Putin, I'm sure, expected would be very serious EU, US-led sanctions for the invasion of Ukraine. But Putin has been very clear. He does not consider Ukraine to be a fully sovereign nation, but really sort of the ethnic and religious kin of the Russian people, fellow Slav Orthodox. He does not intend to ever allow Ukraine to become a member of NATO. Putin is not going to give up Russian sovereignty over Crimea. We'll see to what extent the 4 eastern oblasts are going to be negotiated. He will demand ethnic and civil and religious rights for the ethnic Russians of eastern Ukraine that are not in the 4 oblasts that he now considers to be sovereign Russian territory? And on the other hand, how does Volodymyr Zelensky go back to his people and say, we're going to enter into a ceasefire, which I don't think Putin will accept? Putin's been very open about this. He sees a ceasefire as an opportunity for Ukraine to rest its depleted forces, to restock its military inventory, and to prepare for a serious counteroffensive against Russia's very deeply dug in, triple layered defense all along the eastern oblast and potentially even against Crimea, which could actually trigger a tactical nuclear response from Russia. So this is an extraordinarily combustible situation still, and I give President Trump great credit for trying to bring Presidents Putin and Zelensky together. What I fear, though, Danny, is that Vladimir Putin is not ready for any serious negotiations right now. He feels the wind is at his back. There's been considerable military momentum, very gradual. The meat grinder strategy continues at great loss to Russian soldiers' lives, but they continue to move slowly west towards Kyiv, towards the Dnieper River. And I think Vladimir Putin believes that if he can keep this momentum going for several more months, change the facts on the ground, gain more territory, that's the time to then force some level of capitulation by Zelensky, saying it's really futile to try to push back against these Russian forces. And that's when he'll have more leverage against Zelensky, I believe he believes. And then maybe if there are serious sanctions against India that are maintained for buying Russian oil, I doubt Trump will do this against China because China will retaliate by another cutoff of rare earth elements and pharmaceuticals, perhaps, into the US economy. But we have a lot of leverage against India, and President Trump is exercising that. But this is going to be, I think, a very long, drawn out, complex process. I don't see any imminent breakthrough in the Russian invasion of Ukraine anytime in the weeks or even several months ahead.
So even at a meeting between Putin and Trump, or even if they include Zelensky in some capacity, you don't think that that will result in any kind of breakthrough or even movement towards peace or at least a ceasefire?
In my world, forecasting is a very dangerous business. I try very hard to never try to predict the future, but if I had to read people's minds, which of course I cannot do, but just go by their public statements, but actually more importantly by their actions. I don't believe that Vladimir Putin sees Volodymyr Zelensky as an equal. I don't believe he's in any position to sit down and meet with Zelensky. He wants the meeting with President Trump. That equalizes Putin to the level of Trump and Xi, right? In Putin's mind, there are three great powers in the world. From a realist perspective, there's one great power, the US, there is the pacing power, China, and then really at a tertiary level on the Eurasian continent is Russia. It's not really a global power. But in Putin's mind, he wants to be seen as the equal of the president of the United States, whoever that might be, obviously President Trump right now. But I don't think he will agree to meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky anytime soon. He would only do that when he feels he's in a position to coerce Zelensky into outright capitulation. What I think you may see over the next several weeks is this drawn out process of negotiating a process to negotiate. So I don't think that Putin wants to see the sanctions maintained on India or any of the customers of Russian oil. That could include not China, but it could include countries like Turkey, which is an important NATO ally of the United States, and other major purchasers of Russian oil and other commodities that could see tariffs coming from the United States if Putin doesn't agree to come to the table and at least engage in a negotiating process. But that process could be drawn out for as long as Putin feels he needs to finally be able to achieve the military outcome he wants on the ground in Ukraine, to then be ready to say, okay, now we'll actually start the negotiations. But I think it's going to be a series of pre-negotiating processes for the next several months.
Thank you, John, for sharing your perspectives and everything that we talked about today. Truly great insights, and I appreciate you coming over and joining the show today.
Well, thank you very much for having me and looking forward to continuing our conversation in the weeks and months ahead.
Absolutely.